Welcome back to the React Native Radio Podcast. Brought to you by basketball. Not sure what that is. Episode 297, Jumping Over the React Native 0.74 Bridge with Frank Calise.
So Frank, have you been watching the NBA playoffs recently?
Definitely. You kind of have to when your team's only relevant every decade or so.
We both support the same team for the audience, the New York Knicks, who haven't been great. And if you support the Brooklyn Nets,
Of course, yeah.
They've had a pretty good run. It's actually also interesting to see Villanova kids from Pennsylvania making a big impact on them. And when they beat Philly, Jalen Brunson, I think, or Hart, after he hit a three, kind of pointed at the Villanova banner hanging in the arena. That was pretty cool.
I didn't notice that, but yeah, growing up in the Northeast, you can follow Villanova as you're growing up, definitely. And then the Knicks, it's cool to see the chemistry come back. And it's just a fun team, which we had, growing up in the 90s. So it's nice to have that again. It's
nice to just be in the playoff in general. So I'll take that, regardless of how far they go. And yeah, audience, you probably figured out since I'm host, I have to bring in some sports into it. So I apologize for that. Hopefully we didn't lose any of you already. And as you've noticed, no Jamin or Robin again, but I have a cool episode lined up for you with someone very familiar who doesn't need an intro, who you've probably recognized so far. But as you all know by now, I live in Durham, North Carolina with my wife and toddler. I'm a former pro soccer player and coach and a senior React Native engineer here at Infinite Red. I'm joined by my uncovering co-host, Frank Calise. I think that kind of speaks to you and how you do your software. Uncover a lot of nooks and crannies. Frank is originally from New York and now resides in Bluffton, South Carolina with his wife and dog. He's a purple belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Purple belt, you got that recently, which is pretty cool, and also a senior software engineer here at Infinite Red. Before we get into the topic, let's hear from our sponsor.
This episode is sponsored, as always, by Infinite Red. Infinite Red is a premier React Native consultancy located fully remote in the US and Canada. If you're looking for React Native expertise for your next project, hit us up at infinite.red/React Native, and don't forget to mention that you heard about us through the React Native Radio Podcast.
Okay, let's get into our topic for today. We'll be jumping over the React Native 0.74 bridge. Hopefully people get the play on the words here as to what that references, but we'll get to that reference in a little bit. Frank, why don't you kick us off on what's our first point here?
So in 0.74, we have been graced with Yoga 3.0. which is the newest version of the React Native layout engine. It helps improve layout by making styling more predictable, which we always love, especially cross-platform. One of the big additions to align content is space evenly, which is a new property. This will space your items, each pair of items, and the start and ending edges all the same. So if you're familiar with space around, the edges on the sides, or top and bottom, I guess, depending on your flex direction, were half of the space between your pair of items. So if you like things looking very evenly, this property is for you. So that's a great addition there.
I think as part of this, something that's pretty interesting too is I've noticed row reverse has also been fixed. So basically row reverse, if you do row reverse in the past, left and right or start and end didn't really work right. They were flipped. They have now been flipped again to line up with web. So row reverse and align content space evenly lines up with web. So if you're familiar with React Web and how they do the layout engine there, Yoga 3 kind of brings that. So that's actually, I think, a warning or, probably a breaking change for people's UI. So if you have used row reverse, keep that in mind. But also, if you want to use stuff like space evenly and you did some like wonky layout stuff, you now have access to that to kind of clean up your code.
Definitely. Another item would be support for the position static, which keeps elements from being offset. Again, bringing us closer to web compliance. So that's kind of the theme with Yoga 3.0, I think, and of course going forward.
Mm-hmm.
So what this means is the elements not considered when determining the container block of an absolutely positioned element. So, it allows for positioning of an element relative to its ancestor rather than the direct parent. And what's interesting here is this property is new architecture only. So I'm not sure how that will play into like IntelliSense and TypeScript, and if that property be available, or might trip some people up if they think it's available and new arc is disabled. So that'll be interesting to try out.
That's a weird one. Cool. Moving on to the next point. This kind of plays on the play on words in our title, but new architecture bridgeless is now turned on by default. What? So bridgeless mode is now the default when the new architecture is enabled. So also if you start a new app, this should be automatic. The team will also be working to make sure that all the packages will work with bridgeless from day one. So that's pretty cool that not just the meta team, but also the Expo team are working on making sure that all third-party packages are compatible with bridgeless mode. This upgrade kind of starts pushing us towards full new architecture. Additionally, the new renderer interop layer has also been improved and enabled by default. So that's actually pretty cool. If you want to learn more, I would check out the React Native New Architecture repo. We'll put that in the show notes. That kind of gives you a little bit more of the deep dive into this. But if you've been following us for a while, you know what we're talking about here when we talk about bridgeless and the new renderer interop. So cool stuff coming in a new version for us.
Yeah, I think bridgeless by default has been a great community effort. It's been nice to see, Brent Vatney of Expo kind of spearheaded using some of the EAS data on what are the most common packages being installed that are flying through there, and help target, what should be a priority of making them compatible. And then the community will just continue from there. Once those are done, move on to the next set of most popular ones, and we'll get there incrementally. But it's starting to feel real now, which is cool.
That is awesome.
All right, next up on the list is batched on layout updates. So this is also a new architecture item, but state updates in on layout callbacks are now batched. So previously, if you had multiple on layout callbacks in your render, that would be the same number of renders that would occur. But this looks for all those, batches them together, and results in one re-render. So this is similar to your updates in React 18, which is why, of course, you need the new architecture enabled. There's a blog article on this to, help understand if your code relied on unbatched state updates before, how to tackle this refactoring and make sure that you don't end up in some state you weren't expecting in your new rendering cycle.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I would warn people that are relying, I don't know why you would, but maybe, depending on your UI, UX, app expectation, if you are expecting this to be unbatched because of some user experience you want to have, make sure you re-review the code and make some changes so that that experience stays the same. Because now if you wanted an on layout you had multiple on layouts to create an experience where one will trigger an update to do some specific UI element, and then the next one to do a separate UI element, whatever the case may be. There's so many ideas running through my head. I'm not going to jump through them, but make sure you step around this so that it works for you. This is actually pretty cool, Frank, because I think we were talking about how on layout can be detrimental because it creates so many re-renders, and putting in on layout just feels so tedious. Now with the new architecture, it's easier and cleaner, more performant.
Yeah, it feels like it'll, not just add to the slowdown, which is, it's funny because you want the layout to be quick and responsive, but then you start adding logic in here and maybe it starts to degrade. But it would be nice to see this work out more smoothly.
Cool. Next one is Yarn 3 for new projects. So moving forward, the new default for new projects when you start with the React Native Community CLI will be Yarn 3. Yarn 3 is pretty cool because that also opens up the ability to do mono repos easier. So if you've used somehow, I think there's a way to do it, just very complicated to use regular Yarn 1 to do mono repos, but Yarn 3 is much better. I actually did this upgrade on a project and it's great. It gives you the ability to use a node linker, and that node linker, you point it to your node modules, and this provides compatibility with all your React Native libraries. I think Yarn 3 also comes with caching in that sense. So, your startup and when you do yarn install and, goes through the pod install and all that, that's much quicker these days now. If you want to use a different package, while you're setting up the community CLI, I think they created a new flag called --PM, where you can specify your package manager. That's also in the documentation there. Whether you want to use Bun or even just Yarn, go back to Yarn 1 because you don't necessarily need Yarn 3. So there's that. That's pretty much it for like the higher level items in 74. It's big stuff, but it's also, it might seem small, but it's big stuff. Next, we'll talk about some of the breaking changes that are included. So this is like stuff to kind of keep in mind if you want to make the upgrade in case this affects you.
Yeah, the first breaking change they bring up here is bumping the minimum SDK version of Android to 6.0. So previously we were on 5.0, which is API 21, I believe. Google recommended this bump quite some time ago in 2019, but Meta described that they kept it around to help React Native support a larger number of users. But finally bumping this will allow for simplifying the code base, which should result in a better React Native experience for developers because the simpler code base, less things to maintain for the Meta folks and other contributors, and, hopefully less bugs that way. One bonus of this upgrade is a reduction in Android app size, which is cool. Everyone's always watching the app size, even though startup time's not too bad since Hermes. But it is a nice to have just for the SDK bump.
Yeah, it's 13% smaller. That might seem minimal, but that's big if you think about where we were before Hermes, and then now this is like on top of Hermes. So keep up the good work, Meta folks and community. Next one is actually I think it's a big one. But it might not be a big one necessarily for everybody out there. There have been API changes. Well, not necessarily API changes. There's the plan to remove the push notification iOS API in the React Native package. So what this means is for version 74, the Meta team moved to a new set of APIs on iOS for push notifications. So if this will affect you if you're creating an API provider from scratch using this specific package that Meta provides for us. If you're going to make the bump to 74, make sure you see the API changes because now we're using the newer Apple user notifications framework. So a whole different framework that has a whole different API. So there's some rewrite that needed to happen there. Now, this might be a lot of work because in version 75, this package will be further removed, but put in the React Native community repo and be maintained there. So it's not necessarily going away, but you just have to make sure you call it from somewhere else. So if you are leveraging this, my recommendation would be use a third party, Firebase, Airship, Expo, something along those lines. Or if you're going to make the bump up to 74, go ahead and switch over to the community package because I believe it's already available on there. Go ahead and make that migration to that package and make your API changes all in one, just so that it's less work. You're not doing the work twice, version 74 and version 75. Did that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool. And I'll jump into the next one because the next one actually is big in my mind. There's the removal of the deprecated prop types. So similar to how push notifications are being deprecated and then removed, prop types were deprecated before. Now they're actually being removed. So they were deprecated in React 15.5. That's in 2017. That's crazy because that's kind of when I fell in love with prop types and I used them everywhere. I actually went through a previous repo that I had where I think I've mentioned it on the podcast. My boss wasn't too keen on moving to TypeScript. So I leaned on prop types to basically be my TypeScript engine, could you say? And I loved it. And then, moving over to TypeScript, that kind of went away because I stopped using it or even thinking about it because TypeScript kind of does that work for you anyways. So this is being removed, but also a great change from this is the reduction of the upsize further. So not only do we drop it 13% on Android for moving to the new Android SDK, we're also reducing it further by, what is the value?
26K in a minified bundle.
So yeah, the app size is getting reduced pretty well there. And on top of that too, there's a bunch of memory overhead that's being taken away by getting rid of prop types. So memory improvements, performance improvements, app size bundle improvements, a lot of improvements there by just removing this deprecated package.
Next up is the removal of the Flipper React Native plugin. So
don't get too excited, everyone.
Flipper is officially unsupported now. If you've been using Flipper to debug, you can continue using it, of course. If you're upgrading your existing project to 0.74, you can just skip and ignore the relevant diff lines found in the upgrade helper, and it should continue to work. If you're starting a new project, starting at React Native 0.74, you'll have to follow the instructions over on the Flipper site. They have detailed instructions on how to integrate Flipper to an Android and iOS project. In Ignite, we already pulled it out. I'm used to not using it at this point. Mm-hmm. But if you're wondering where to go next for life after Flipper, you can check out Jamin's blog post on why you don't need Flipper in your React Native app. We'll link that in the show notes. And that covers, the native tools are already available through Android Studio and Xcode, which Matt is recommending here on the blog post. Of course, our favorite at Infinite Red, Reactatron, and a couple others out there. And now with the new debugger and Expo debugging tools, there's kind of a large tool bag that everyone will have to get used to in changing their ways with this being unsupported now going forward.
Cool. So there's other breaking changes. I'm not necessarily going to go into all of them. I would advise people just to take a quick skim on it and just make sure that they don't affect you necessarily. One that stands out to me is kind of similar to the upgrade in the Yoga engine. Start and end in your styles. So if you do, padding end or margin start, whatever combination you have, will now always refer to a writing direction. So that's big because, we did some stuff on Ignite for moving on to RTL with Arabic included in Ignite. And if people kind of dissected that, you would have noticed that we were using start and end exclusively. Now with this upgrade, this also further solidifies that is the better way to kind of move forward. So always use start and end in your styling if you're using internationalization or even just, RTL, if RTL is even in your roadmap, because it's easier to refactor further down the line. Yeah, there are other stuff. I would recommend checking it out. Also see the full change log for a full complete list. We usually don't go into it unless, something kind of stands out to us, but all those are in the show notes. Since this is about React Native 0.74 upgrade, we're not going to touch on Expo, but we might in a future episode once it comes out, because right now version 51 is beta. And if you're using Expo flavoring in your app, you have to wait for 51 to come out to be able to make this upgrade in the first place. So keep your eyes peeled for that, and we'll kind of see how it goes. And as always with these episodes, I like to give kudos to different people who helped make this version a reality. 0.74 contains over 1,673 commits from 57 contributors. That's a lot.
That is crazy.
Thank you all. Yeah, thank you all for the amazing work you're always doing. People at Meta, special thanks to Alfonso of Coinbase and Alan of Expo, who were part of this release crew for the first time. That's a big deal. We spoke to Lorenzo and Ricardo. about the release process. It's very complicated, and a lot of steps kind of go into it. And as always, if you want to upgrade, check out the upgrade helper, or my favorite part, just edit a new app and copy over your code, and you're brand new and up to date. Gotta love that. Well, speak to your boss first. So that's it for this episode. Usually Robin has this last segment, but Frank, do you have a dad joke to kind of kick us out?
I do. This one is courtesy of Jamin. My sister's toddler has been chewing on electrical cords. She's going to ground him until he conducts himself properly.
That's a good one. Jamin made it into the episode. Well, thank you, Frank, for being on. This was awesome. It was awesome having you on here talking about this. And see you all next time.
See ya.
As always, thanks to our production team, with editor Todd Worth, our assistant editor, this guy, Jed Bartosky, our director of communications and episode release coordinator, Justin Husky, and our guest coordinator, Derek Greenberg. Our producer and host is Jamin Holmgren, and executive producers and hosts are Robin Hines and Mazen Chami. Thanks to our sponsor, Infinite Red. Check us out at infinite.red/reactnative. A special thanks to all of you listening today. Make sure to subscribe to React Native Radio wherever you get your podcasts. And leave us a review. We'd love to hear what you think.